Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this additional session of the UNBC Northwest Public Presentation Series. We're quite fortunate to have Dr. Ted Binnema here today, based at the Prince George campus. And he's giving a presentation today that is a nice follow-up to last week's by Derek Denholm, in which he talked about the salmon forest. Dr. Binnema will extend that information in yet another dimension. It's also nicely sandwiched just before the first day of open season for bull moose in the region, October 20th. Hide your cows and mules, the hunters will be out on the logging roads. As with many of these presentations, I value the opportunity to get to know our speakers in a little more detail, and Ted informs me that he actually went to high school in the Bulkley Valley, which I didn't know, and he's actually lived in many different provinces across Canada, got his degrees at the University of Alberta, and he's been on the faculty at UNBC as a professor of history since the year 2000. And I might also add that he's been a strong leader of the Faculty Association, so don't get him started about academic politics. Ted, you have an interesting story to tell us this morning.
Yes, I do, and it certainly is something that intrigued me when my family moved from Northern Ontario, which was real moose country, to the Bulkley Valley in 1978. Also being really good moose country. I remember even as a teenager being told by the old timers, there never used to be moose here, and they had various explanations, but for me that was an enigma I kind of would have liked to have explained. And when I came back to Northern British Columbia as a faculty member at UNBC in 2000. Eventually I got to this topic. I was going through Hudson's Bay Company documents anyway and other kinds of historical documents, though that's my field. I'm gradually trying to work on explaining this enigma, which was summarized by Valerius Geist in 2011 this way. So it's not just the grassroots inhabitants of Northern British Columbia who are intrigued by this enigma, but so our scientists, biologists have been intrigued by it for quite a while. So that's the mystery as I see it. But I want to emphasize that I believe that the mystery of the expansion of the moose range into northern British Columbia has all kinds of connections with other species. And so it's not just a matter of curiosity, it also has implications for wildlife management to this day. So for example, of course, mountain caribou are of significant interest now as they're declining. It's clear to me at least, and I think to others, that the connection between the decline of the mountain caribou and the proliferation of moose are actually connected. So I'm not going to go into huge detail in some of what I'm going to talk about, because I'm mindful of the time. I'm going to try to compress everything I'd like to say into about 40 minutes so that you might have time to ask questions. So I'm not going to go through this slide in great detail, but I can tell you that I've put together here the 5 kind of categories of explanations that scholars have come up with, and I've thrown in some of the popular stuff as well, the explanations that have been put forward for the absence and then the expansion of moose over the years. So number 1, is it because of European settlement? Did that alter the forest? And I'm certainly, as somebody who grew up in the Bulkley Valley, I always heard about the railway, the the railway brought in the moose, and that works for the Bulkley Valley particularly well because the popular histories and the communal memory of the history of that region makes pretty clear that moose arrived in the Bulkley Valley in around the same time as the railway did. So it works there, but it doesn't work elsewhere. It doesn't work in vast areas of northern British Columbia where either the railway never came, or the moose arrived long before the railway, or long before forestry and that sort of thing. Number two, some scientists have argued that perhaps the extermination of wolves allowed moose to proliferate. And again, the order is opposite of what history suggests. In fact, wolves proliferated when moose arrived. It's pretty clear from the documentary evidence. As we go farther down here, the explanations are more and more speculative because there's less and less evidence. So I can go back to this slide later if you want, but I want to move on to what I particularly want to talk about. This is a map produced by James Hatter, who published or wrote a PhD dissertation on the question in 1950. So this is his map in his dissertation of 1950. You maybe can't read it very well, but this dark area shows what he saw as the range of the moose in 1860, and then 1950, the time he wrote his dissertation. And it was a time, in fact, in the 1950s when there was a significant collapse in moose populations, and the moose were starving, they were suffering from ticks, and so he was attempting to deal with an issue then, and so he was interested in both the rapid expansion of the range of moose and then the apparent collapse. That, by the way, is I think the best map of the range of the bison, or of the moose until relatively recently. In 1990, David Spaulding produced this map. The problem with the map is that he just took regions, and if moose were reported in a region, he colored the whole region gray. And so it's far too coarse a measurement, I think, to be of any use, unfortunately. This map is from a report done in the 1960s. It shows more detail than what Hatter had. It shows a line in 1860, 1900, this area, then 1930, and I thought I'd include this one particularly because it shows some detail in the area we're sitting in here. It shows in the terrace area moose arriving by about 1950. You can't read this from where you are, but that's 1963. So that shows the phenomenon. Anyway, there's little doubt about the phenomenon. There's questions about why. There's my map. It's the range of moose in what I'd say, when Europeans first arrived in the late 1700s, and what the historical documents say for that period. I also show the 3 different subspecies of moose, because biologists will know that species tend to form subspecies when they're isolated from one another, and so that's significant. The Ulces andersoni is the moose that we're familiar with here. Just for your information, it is the subspecies of moose that you'll find all the way across to Labrador. In the Northwest, we have farther northwest from British Columbia, Atlin. Farther northwest, you have the Alaskan moose, and then a smaller subspecies in the very southeast corner of British Columbia and into Montana, and Idaho. I'm not going to go too much into what that all means, except that it I think is a function of the isolation of the moose populations. The historical documentation suggests that moose were sporadically present in areas of the Chilcotin, and that's also interesting. And I've talked a little bit with fisheries biologists about what that might mean. Generally speaking, then, this is what I'm. I should point out that none of these scientists have pointed out this reality that this line seems to separate the salmon realm from the moose realm, and that's so. This is generally, I think, what we can say is that in areas where salmon historically were very abundant, there were no moose. Where moose were very abundant, there were no salmon. And as we move through the Pacific slope from areas where salmon are very abundant to less abundant, we're more and more likely to see moose. You drive from here to Edmonton, you pass by Moose Lake eventually, and I think historically, why is a place called Moose Lake? Well, that's where we're moving east. It's where you historically encountered more and more moose. It's sort of like, in northern Manitoba, there's a Cedar Lake. As you move inland, that's where you begin to see cedar. The scholar who's gotten closest to what I'm suggesting is a man by the name of Charles Kay, who's at the University of Utah, who wrote this interesting thing, where Native Americans had access to salmon and plentiful vegetal resources. There were few or no moose, but where salmon or other foods were scarce or absent, moose were relatively more abundant. He published that in, some of you are going to be surprised to know there's an entire scholarly journal devoted to moose called Ulces. But others of you won't be surprised to know that. Anyway, he published that in that journal in 1997. I think he was on to something, but I've met him before. He's one of these people who wears khaki to conferences. Very avid game hunter, but he has some interesting ideas. So I asked the question then, if this is true, do salmon eat moose? I was going to download the audio file for Jaws, but that was going to be too complicated for me. So then, did salmon moose? Well, I'd say metaphorically, yes, they did. However, what I want to do, or I started out this research geared towards explaining the dynamics from moose, salmon, mountain caribou, and so on. And as I went on, I was increasingly influenced by some of this literature by scientists, and the name of the scientist that he unfortunately drowned a few years ago in Southern California, who was really an advocate of landscape reconstruction. And what he was complaining about, and I guess maybe this won't surprise you, he's a scientist who's complaining that too many scientists specialize on one or two species, and that the specialization has blinded them to some of the broader dynamics. And so he was calling for scientists to become increasingly more generalists again. There's still something good about the 1700s when you tried to learn everything about everything. No longer possible, I suppose. But so what I did, inspired by that, is went through the historical documents, because I was sensing that, as a matter of fact, it was worthwhile to try to reconstruct entire ecosystems as they existed in the past. And as a good humanist, somebody who studies the human beings, unlike many scientists, I want to assume that humans are part of this. And it's amazing how many times when scientists attempt to reconstruct or try to manage environments, they particularly like environments like national parks or game reserves where humans have kind of been taken out of them, which to a historian is counterintuitive, since humans were in these environments for thousands of years. Why are we trying to create some kind of baseline in where they are absent? So, again, I get a lot of blowback, I guess, from scientists when I say that science is as everybody's political as history, and I know just how political the term Keystone species can be. So some scientists who are studying spotted owls in Oregon will want to say that spotted owl is a keystone species in Oregon. So there's all kinds of competing definitions of keystone species. But I think by just about any definition of keystone species, salmon will qualify in what is northern British Columbia, the Pacific slope historically. I would argue they are not a keystone species today. And the time in which they are transitioning from keystone species to not keystone species also has changes the entire environment. So, yeah, there's the results. So I can't go through all of the documentary evidence, but you'll see the species that I'm talking about on this image, but I'm trying to reconstruct an entire ecosystem. So this is the salmon realm before 1860, and what I've done here is put in blue the species that are far more abundant or important in this ecosystem before 1860 than they are now, and I put in red those species that were either absent or virtually absent before that period. As I said, salmon is a keystone species in this. It really shapes the entire ecosystem. Couple things I want to mention about it. So I've arranged this by trophic levels. And I've kind of indicated that on the right-hand side. And there's a lovely term in the bottom left there, allochthonous. If anybody knows what that means, but it essentially, scientists describe allochthonous resources as those resources produced in another ecosystem that come into an ecosystem. Salmon. So the salmon migrating up rivers and dying there, so they're not only allochthonous, they're semalparous, they reproduce once and then die, is equivalent to taking many thousands of dump truck loads of incredible fertilizer and driving those dump truck loads of fertilizer and dumping them along the rivers right up into near the Great Divide. And what we're looking at is rivers that, if you've tried to take a plunge into a British Columbia river near its headwaters, any time of the year, it's kind of an uncomfortable experience. The water's cold, it's not nutrient rich. So the injection of these nutrients every year, and I understand this was probably, I'm now repeating what you were being told maybe last week. Right? Anyway, this is very important, and American fisheries scientists have done particularly a lot with this, and they estimate that the amount of nutrition brought into this ecosystem by salmon today is less than 5% of what it was in the past, in this period, right? Because we're harvesting those salmon out at sea. So the number of salmon who are arriving and dying in the upper reaches of rivers is less than 5% of what it was previously. So that's crucial. Particularly, those salmon are being harvested, so those that are dying are benefiting invertebrates, and as particularly again American fisheries biologists are saying they're also through this way. What are important consumers of invertebrates? Well, salmon fry themselves. So in a sense, salmon are feeding salmon. But there are two of these that can particularly benefit from salmon. The problem with salmon is that they're absent from rivers for several months of the year, depending on where you are, either 4 months of the year or 6 or 7 months of the year, depending on where you are. So while we know that wolves will eat salmon and do eat salmon, if they're absolutely dependent on salmon, they will starve to death in the winter. Bears don't, because they store the calories from salmon and consume them in the wintertime during their hibernation. Humans, of course, can benefit from salmon even when they're absent because they store them. That explains then, the presence of salmon explains why humans and bears were far more abundant in the salmon realm before 1860 than they are in the adjoining area. So, if I go through this, then because there are so many salmon, there are abundant humans and bears. Now, because there are so many humans and bears, there are so few moose, because humans and bears are very effective predators on moose. And I'll elaborate on this later. Now, because there are no large ungulates, and indeed because there are so few animals, and the fur trade documents make this so abundantly clear, because there are so few animals larger really than beaver, there are very few or no wolves. And again, when I look at the scientific literature says the myth that a wolf pack can survive on, let's say, snowshoe hares, this has now pretty much been disproven. It's not that bears won't eat snowshoe hares, but a wolf pack will die of starvation if the largest prey it has access to is smaller than a beaver. It needs something larger. So because humans and bears keep moose absent, wolves are also absent. Because there are so few moose, there are many snowshoe hares. The remarkable thing is if you take the range in North America of the moose today, the range of the moose is almost identical to the snowshoe hare. And it's remarkable, scientists have even done this, to see in terms of are they direct competitors for the same food? And they are. Snowshoe hares will even eat as high up a bush in the winter during the snow as moose do. So, and again, the Hudson Bay Company documents remark on the tremendous abundance of snowshoe hares in this region, unlike in the subarctic in the past. So we've got so few snowshoe hares because essentially they're a replacement for moose. And of course, if you've got so many snowshoe hares, you have lynx. Fur traders were so interested in all of this because here are the species that were brought in for trade in northern British Columbia by Aboriginal people in far larger numbers than they were at Île-à-la-Crosse or other places east of the mountains. And of course, these are fancy furs. After 1840, when the market for beaver disappears, these are tremendous. These are the most profitable, and so New Caledonia as a trading area becomes proportionately that much more valuable. Okay. This isn't scientific papers. It's mostly, I'm a historian, so I'm going to deal primarily with the relationship then between humans and bears and salmon. It's well known that the human population of the Northwest Coast was exceptionally high. This is my attempt just to, obviously there was no census done in 1841. This is my attempt to estimate population dynamics in the northern half of North America, let's say at 1491. What I'm trying to indicate is that in the salmon realm, we have population densities at far more than 10 times as high as elsewhere. In fact, if you take the area that is now Canada, the population that is in blue there is about 7% of the surface area of Canada. It probably is about 50% of the population, human population at that time. I can tell you there's not a place in the world where a non-agricultural people lived in higher population density than in the northwest coast of North America, which is why some anthropologists have found it interesting. Furthermore, moose were not found in the vicinity of population densities that high anywhere in the world. And moose are a species that came to North America from Asia. It's also in Asia. So that's the area I'm interested in. So we have then, if we look at the population dynamics of the moose realm and the salmon realm, let's say in 1491, we have a picture like this. How many people is that? This is hard to estimate. Scholars estimate that population 1491 as low as 75,000. That's the lowest estimate. Some would say, no, that's probably 250,000. During the fur trade era, there was a chronic shortage of thick leather in that region. And I particularly study the fur trade documents in Edmonton, and there's a regular trade of leather into this region. Moose leather is gathered in Edmonton, brought to this region and traded there. So there is a demand for moose hides in this region that far exceeds the ability actually to supply it. A student at UNBC a number of years ago did some oral histories with Aboriginal people around Fort St. James, and these people said, yeah, there weren't moose in this country when moose came. They were so valuable, we killed them because we needed those resources. And time again, David Thompson, fur traders say moose are the most highly esteemed, their meat is the most highly esteemed of all the meat. Their leather, their hides are particularly highly ranked. And moose are relatively easy to kill, both if you're a human and if you're a bear. Moose, and this is why they are so dangerous to us, I suppose, they are hardwired to stand their ground when they're being attacked. And the scientific literature shows that an adult moose that stands its ground, even against a wolf pack of 20 or more members, will probably survive. If it stands its ground, the wolf pack will circle that moose to try to convince it to flee. And if it doesn't, they'll abandon it. The moment the moose begins to flee, and some do, particularly sub-adults and so on, they're toast. Well, that's a good adaptation for wolves. It's a ineffective adaptation for a human population that has small, well-trained dogs. And already in 1836, John Richardson published a book on North American animals, and one of his entries was for the carrier Indian dog, which he said was a very small dog which was trained to cause moose to stand their ground and made the moose easy prey. Again, you can Google this. It's a little gruesome. You can Google grizzly bear attacking moose, and you can find on YouTube videos of grizzly bears taking down full adult moose. So although bears, and particularly black bears, typically take only the younger animals. Now, when humans and wolves, or bears, whatever, are able to take down, diminish the population of moose in the subarctic, what happens is that the prey starves, because moose are the primary prey for moose or for wolves and humans in the region, in the subarctic, in the fur trade era. In this region, that won't happen, because moose are only a very minor component of the diet of bears and moose, and bears and humans. And so bears and humans are able to do what biologists call prey switching. So in this environment, bears and humans historically can, because they are not dependent on moose, they're able to hunt them into as low a population that they're essentially absent. So is that plausible? Well, the moose population of British Columbia in the last 10 years is estimated at something less than 200,000. Humans kill fewer than 20,000 moose per year. There are 8,000 to 14,000 licenses per year, depending on where the moose population is. So if there are then a maximum of 14,000 moose killed per year legally, then you have about as many as 12,000 that might be killed by cars and trains. There's the Aboriginal hunt, there's poaching. Now in the fur trade era, fur traders estimated that Aboriginal people in the subarctic killed an average of 4 moose per year. And that's what they needed for food and for clothing. Now, if we assume the smallest human population, let's say that's 75,000, and estimate a demand for only 1 moose per year, we now have a demand in terms of, and it's particularly high because the problem with salmon is it doesn't give you clothing. And it does get a little cool and clammy in the Northwest. Ideally, you've got something to wear. There's also quite a trade along the coast for hides for armor. That the demand for moose hides in this region clearly is far more than what could sustainably be hunted. Now, so that's that then is the argument here is that this becomes a predator pen for any moose that come into this area. So at some point when salmon became central to the human economies of this region, gradually over hundreds of years, now probably thousands of years ago, moose were gradually extirpated from this region, and subsequently moose would have wandered into what is essentially a predator pit, and their numbers would have been kept low. What then changes between the 1860s and 1913? So I think the timing is crucial. And I'm going to put this up. This is what I would describe how the ecosystem changes gradually by 1900. And I think the timing is crucially important because you see it already in the Prince George, Barkerville area in the period shortly after 1860. So it's before the coming of non-fur trade settlement, before the railway, before the forestry industry. It happened in the east before it happened in the west. It happened in the north before it happened in the south. But it's ongoing. It's continuing through the state of Washington and Oregon to this date. The expansion is continuing. So I'll talk about various factors. Contrary to what many scholars assume, the human exploitation of salmon and moose declined between 1862 and 1913. The Aboriginal population declined. There's a huge measles epidemic in 1848. There's a smallpox epidemic in 1862. That reduced the role of humans in this system. There was also, because of the European trade, an increased reliance on textiles. And one of the things that Europeans traded a lot more, and certainly as somebody who's done the research on the subarctic, you might think that the Chippewayan and the Cree and the Ojibwa would particularly want European textiles. Not so. It's particularly in the Northwest that European textiles took off, and the lesser reliance on moose also reduced the pressure on moose. There's also, I think this is crucial, the introduction and increasingly effective enforcement of game and fish conservation laws in the late 1880s and 1890s. We also have the very significant reduction of Aboriginal mobility. Aboriginal people were restricted to reserves. The hunting of animals with dogs was banned, and essentially human hunting for subsistence was significantly suppressed in the 1880s and 1890s, reducing the pressure on moose significantly. Now, again, the second main thing I want to point out is that contrary to what many scholars have asserted and what people assume, game conservation laws in the late 1800s were not passed primarily to protect, conserve species. They were passed selectively to cultivate certain species. I would argue that's still the case. Although the word wildlife, until 1920, if you referred to wildlife, that was a party, a very raunchy party in the backcountry. Wildlife, single word, was coined in the 1920s. Until then, there were two kinds of animals. You had game and you had vermin. And you killed vermin so that you'd have more game. In a lot of ways, that's still the case today. But there's ample documentary evidence that the game management branches in the British Columbia, right from their inception, were designed to cultivate game species. And I found documents, the Canadian government in the 1880s calculated that big game hunters from Eastern North America and Europe typically spent between $5,000 and $7,000 in 1880s dollars per large animal they killed. and there was a huge effort to convince Europeans and folks from Philadelphia and so on, come to British Columbia, you're bound to get a moose. And so from the perspective of the bureaucracy, this becomes a game is to be propagated. There's not a concern with here's how many we had, we want to maintain that number. We want essentially to cultivate them. In the meantime, in 1937, there was a $10 bounty on wolf skins. Attitudes towards bears was a little more ambivalent because although they preyed on other creatures, they were nonetheless also hunted by big game hunters. But it's clear that the number of bears in northern British Columbia was declining in the 1920s. Studies have been done for Northern Ontario where there's a clear correlation between game conservation laws and the proliferation of moose in places like Manitoba and Ontario. There's also reason to believe that in the 19-teens, a series of very favorable winters really also encouraged the rapid expansion of moose in that period. And I would say that the coming of the forest industry did also play a role as time went on. So in sum, the documentary evidence makes it clear that during the fur trade era, the food web of the salmon realm was structured fundamentally differently than the adjoining moose realm and fundamentally differently than it is structured today. Essentially, the salmon realm ecosystem gradually transformed into a ecosystem that looks a lot more like the adjoining subarctic. These findings mean that scholars in a wide range of disciplines, from anthropology to zoology, I found A to Z, need to adjust their perceptions of the environment in British Columbia before the 20th century. For those in the sciences, or for those tasked with managing the environment, including those who seek to protect certain species at risk, I would say at the very least, the challenges before you are daunting indeed. Thank you.
We have lots of time for questions.
That was the idea.
What about caribou in this region? Like, how significant are they? What role did that play in wolf and human?
Well, so in terms of caribou, the interesting thing that I find is that if you take maps of the distribution of the woodland caribou and the mountain caribou, that would lead you to believe that the mountain caribou is a product of the system and of the salmon realm. So in other words, when you get further north along the Rocky Mountains, you'll encounter fewer mountain caribou, and so the argument, and if I go, again, how far back do I need to go here? Oh, there we are. That of course, fur traders describe what central British Columbia as the caribou because that's the only large ungulate they found when they first arrived. And the argument I would put forward is that because wolves were absent and mountain caribou could persist in this region, they come down. They're available to wolves only for part of the year, so they can't be the main food source. So, I mean, this is why I say for a game manager, if I'm correct, the only way to save the mountain caribou today would be to put salmon back as the keystone species. Well, you can imagine a environmental management that says, well, we're going to stop harvesting salmon because we need to let them die and contribute all their nutrients to the environment of northern British Columbia. I suspect that's not going to succeed. So the only hope, if I'm right, then the only hope for the mountain caribou is this kind of chronic intervention, where we say, some people say, well, we need to stop logging in certain areas to allow moose up. This would suggest that the challenge is actually more fundamental than that, and that really as long as this dynamic doesn't exist, if you want the mountain caribou, you've got to count on a chronic intervention in which you either you wipe out the wolves, which of course is politically quite difficult, or you go one trophic level farther down and you say, well, we're going to suppress the population of moose. That's also extremely would be very contentious. But I would say that the mountain caribou is absolutely a product of this long-term ecosystem.
How come they wouldn't have been hunted to the same extent as the moose prior to 1860?
They wouldn't be hunted by wolves because they're too high up. They're inaccessible for the winter time. When I've gone through fur trade documents, Aboriginal people hunted the mountain caribou only from about the earliest I've found is about the middle of December to the end of March. So they also really don't go out into the high country in that period to hunt them. They hunt them when the snow is crusty in the spring and when the caribou come down to calve. And that's quite literally. I've gone through whatever fur trade journals exist, and those are the outer limits. Generally, it's really very late December, middle of March. So they're safe for much of the year.
Just because of their local habitat.
Pardon me?
Because of their habitat.
Because of their habitat, and snowshoe hare are very abundant and much easier to get.
Can I ask a question about elk and the rise of elk? Does it run parallel to moose? I mean, there's not elk in. Could we see in the future elk moving over the Rockies to Prince George and then into the Bulkley Valley too?
Well, I've had farmers, maybe I shouldn't be saying this out loud, but because the elk have moved into Salmon Valley and so on, and I've had Salmon Valley farmers tell me that because they're not allowed to kill them on their land, I've had some say they're such a nuisance that they kill them and bury them because they don't even dare put them in the freezer. But they're enough of a nuisance they're proliferating there. Elk are a little different. Of course, there are elk on the Pacific Coast. Elk will flee humans in the way that bears don't. So on Vancouver Island and all along the Roosevelt elk, for example, they're wired differently. So that dynamic is different.
But would that impact the moose? Like, how does that enter the flow chart here? Would possibly elk or another ungulate impact moose?
Absolutely, and you're asking a historian to predict the future, which
one historian to another.
We're just as bad at that as anybody else, and that's the neat thing about this. When you're managing animals and you try to anticipate, the trophic cascading that will happen, it's impossible to anticipate all the possibilities, right? Which is why it's neat that you can go back sometimes, because you can say, oh, you would never have predicted these results, but you can go back and say, so these were the consequences of, and there's people have done this. I'm surprised more historians haven't done this in northern British Columbia, because the literature on Newfoundland is really quite a bit more developed. We can see how Newfoundlanders introduced the snowshoe hare in the 1860s, and it had consequences in terms of trophic cascading throughout the system that rippled right through. But the literature here isn't as strong.
Couple of questions. Pre-contact and whatever literature you found in that sort of that adjacent documentation, was trade in moose prevalent pre-fur trade from the interior to the coast, like similar to grease trails? I've never heard of a moose trail, but it sounds like they were valued by some parties. Was that happening? And so that was the first question, and just so I don't lose it. And the second question was, I lost it. Answer that question, I'll remember.
Okay. Well, one thing that I find very remarkable, I mean, it's called a grease trail because grease is going in. What's going the other direction? And when Alexander Mackenzie goes through in 1793, I tell students, try to walk from the Fraser River to the Pacific coast as quickly as Alexander Mackenzie did. You would never do it. Right? And one thing he remarks as he's going west is how many people are carrying moose furs. He says they're carrying a whole bunch of different kind of furs, and he explicitly says, many of the furs are to get to the coast, and they'll be traded by Europeans. And he says, except for the moose furs, which are for the local market. And clearly, we know about the grease trails and how easily they could be traveled. But that's Alexander Mackenzie explicitly. That's the gem for a historian. If he hadn't have done that, you would have to put this off decades later. But he explicitly talks about it.
Okay, I remember my second question.
Okay.
Indigenous populations in managing for species, we know that it happened. Why was it happening for moose in those zones where it was moose was movement into west of the Rockies, or was any management happening in any area to increase their numbers because of the value in trade?
Okay, so this is where when I mentioned Charles Kay, if you remember the title of his article, which is what I object to, Aboriginal overkill. All right, so I mean, a very politically motivated article in which he tries to debunk the argument that Aboriginal people were environmental stewards. I would argue we're not really looking at overkill, but neither I would say you're talking about a resource that moves. And this is one thing that I certainly emphasize. All of the documentation shows that not only lynx and hare, which are famous for fluctuating, but the population of all species fluctuates over the kind of mid-term. Certainly I started my research on the Northwestern Plains, where we look at bison, and many people argue that the bison declined this way over the years, and much of that was Aboriginal hunting. In fact, moose populations or bison populations cycle. I'm talking about a process that so salmon really become core to Aboriginal economies on the Northwest Coast at least about 5,000 years ago. As they would have done so, the pressure on moose populations would have been gradual. Their extirpation, so to speak, from areas would have been very gradual. So by the 1790s, when the documentary record emerges, moose are essentially absent from this environment for hundreds of years in a process that would have been very gradual. To describe this as Aboriginal overkill, to my mind, is silly. So then if you say, what do you do with the evidence, and it's now preserved in the MA thesis at UNBC, where Aboriginal elders say, yeah, no, when they wandered into our territory, we killed them. Well, there are competing Aboriginal communities. Really isn't a capacity to say, well, we're going to cultivate moose in this territory, because if you don't get them, bears will, the wolves will, or other communities will. So it's unrealistic, in essence, to impose 21st century values about conservation, to impose that on a human population.
My parallel thinking was burning, the pattern of burning to increase berry production, that
Yeah.
increases bear traffic, that increases opportunities at multiple levels in the ecosystem. And we know that's happened for a good long time.
Right.
So where you can do that and you get multiple benefits for
Mhm.
reproduction, you in essence are cultivating, even though it's not a sedentary culture. But was there evidence of that to increase browse for moose populations, that kind of thing, anywhere east where the population, I get that the populations are probably more transient as farther east you go. I don't know my ethnohistory going eastward, so just wondering if they did anything like that happened here in ecosystems where there was ecosystem management of a type.
So are you asking, let's say, of the subarctic, let's say?
Yeah, because if moose was valued that much,
Right.
was there effort made to manage for it to increase opportunity in trade?
Yeah, I mean, there's abundant evidence of strategic burning, both on the Great Plains and in the subarctic. A guy by the name of Henry Lewis from the University of Alberta has done all kinds of stuff on what's now northern Alberta. I had a graduate student a number of years ago who gathered as much evidence as he could about Aboriginal burning in northern British Columbia, which is also a bit of a gap. So we know it happened here. It's often difficult from the historical documentation to say whether that was happening, let's say, in northern British Columbia to increase berry production, or large game population, or both, because that evidence is hard to gather at this point. But clearly it's happening in other areas, and again, where it is absolutely crucial, in the subarctic, where human populations are utterly dependent on moose. That may be far more the target. As I said, here, so much of that is acquired by trade, essentially from the Peace Country, especially. That's where Alexander Mackenzie thought all the moose hides were coming from.
Let's maybe finish going down the list of other large ungulates. What do the records show about the abundance of deer, black-tailed deer, mule deer in northern BC?
I'm afraid that in that regard, invisible. I haven't seen them even mentioned in the documents. They're not mentioned in furs coming in. Same with, I put cougars up there, but cougar furs are not coming in Hudson Bay Company posts in the region until much later. I guess the issue is that as a fur, deer are not valued. So they're going to be, if they appear, they're going to be underrepresented in fur trade documents, because nobody's going to say, holy cow, we got a deer in today. As a food source, in some Fort Alexandria, you'll find them, but that's a environment where deer are going to be is going to be a little better for deer than, let's say, once you get out of the grassier areas, but very little, I'm afraid.
So they would have seemed to have invaded from the south at about the same times that the moose is invading from the northeast, is that?
As far as I can tell, yeah, the range expansion of deer and caribou would be from a later period.
We actually have an online question as well, I think stemming to this. It says, part of this approach suggests wolves were also rare prior to 1860. What evidence do you have of this?
Okay, wolves are, again, I've done, again, my interest is in, my primary area of research is the Northwestern Plains. The vast majority of wolf furs traded by the Hudson's Bay Company are from the plains. Minuscule, even from the subarctic, actually. But there's virtually no trade in wolf furs in northern British Columbia in this period. And when traders occasionally have to write district reports, they do not mention wolves as a significant part of the fauna of the region. So that's where that comes from.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me, the human moose collection or connection in terms of the population, large populations. But I'm having trouble wrapping my head around the salmon abundance or salmon health, because healthy populations of salmon exist along the coast until the 20s or 30s, and in a lot of areas there's still really healthy populations of salmon, like in the Babine or the Nass and other systems, and there's lots of moose there. So that connection is tough for me to have.
Okay, and that's why I emphasized it's not just the abundance of salmon, but it is the removal of salmon as a keystone species. So in other words, salmon don't play the same role in the system that they did before the 1860s. They're harvested differently. Their contributions to the food web are fundamentally changed. So that's the argument.
Another online question?
We got another one. I think it kind of stems from your previous answer. It was, and I will say it, it's quite the hypothesis. What about industries such as forestry or transmission lines that also impact habitat? The access roads play a huge role. Moose become more dispersed on the landscape. Female moose mortality is greater affected and affects the future population. Based on your study, this does not include industry, nor does it state the effects of industry since the logging industry has began.
Right, so my paper, the terminal dates are 1793 to 1913. And the reason I ended with 1913 is we have additional dynamics, including the forest industry, the railway, mining, and so on after that. And I threw it in as only one or two sentences, but I acknowledge, and maybe I should have emphasized it more, but that post-1913, I think there are all those additional dynamics that also influences. Certainly, the forest industry, the cut blocks and so on, in a later period, also complicate the picture. But that's part of the reason why, as a historian, I thought my presentation is primarily about that period before that can have been an ingredient. But absolutely, I agree.
I think we got maybe just one more online, just to follow up. Again, it is kind of akin to the initial wolf question, and they counter it. Could it be more that because wolves weren't harvested for furs on the coast? He points out that wolves are a cornerstone of his identity. I don't know who this is, but they say they're Niska and part of the Jibu wolf clan family.
So what's the question?
It was relating to wolves. It said, I think you were saying that wolves were hunted more in the plains than they were on the coast, and I think he was saying a similar. Could it be that more because wolves weren't harvested for furs on the coast? Yeah, I think it's just a kind of a counter or furthers a point of an answer you made earlier.
Right. Yeah.
I think we'll close discussion there. Please join me in thanking Ted for joining us today. Appreciation here is a UNBC umbrella for your future visits to the rainforest.
That's a Northwest Coast edition.
Thank you, everybody. And we do have another presentation next week at this time. Tina Bahan will be speaking next week on Women's History Month in Canada and related issues as part of the Inspiring Women Among Us series. Thank you for coming.